What's up, guys? Welcome back to the channel and some more bolt action coverage here. So we're moving on with our scenario reviews for the Market Garden campaign book, and we'll eventually slide into all the other components of the book. But first, we're taking a look at scenarios. So this is scenario 2, Heeswijk Castle. Hopefully not butchering that name too much. And basically, this is an interesting little scenario here where some troops basically didn't land in the correct position or correct spot, and now have to sort of make do with what they've got and still try and accomplish their mission somewhat here. So on this forces side here, the German forces consist of 2 5-man patrols armed with 1 SMG, I do believe. Unfortunately, the binding there is cutting it off, and 4 rifles. They are reinforced by another 2 patrols of identical strength arriving in the center of the northern, western, and southern edges of the table at the discretion of the German player in turn 2, and then by 2 squads, each with an LMG and NCO with SMG at either corner of the western edge in turn 3, and another basically anywhere along the northern, western, or southern edges in turn 4 to simulate troops in the vicinity being drawn by the sound of gunfire. So again, things will rapidly get bad here for the Allies. So this scenario is designed for an American paratrooper company. A company should consist of 3 platoons, each comprising 3 squads and a command group, plus a company command group to make a total of 13 units, so a fair bit of stuff here. However, a more interesting option, and one that avoids building a full parachute infantry company, because that is a fair bit of models there, is to replace 1 platoon with 4 support elements such as MMG, mortar, or bazooka teams, or anti-tank gun. And again, you have all kinds of other flexibility too. If you want to make this a much smaller scale mission, different troop types, again, feel free to customize and play it out in different iterations and see what you come up with. So you don't always have to stick word to word or to everything that's in a given book or supplement like this. To reflect the confusion likely to be engendered by landing in the wrong place, not to mention climbing out of a moat, the Allied commander only gets 10 order dice, so it's imperative to get units off the table as quickly as possible. The Allied player will start the game with more units than dice, and obviously loses a die for any squad that is destroyed, so it'll be very rough to get things manageable and managed and accomplish your mission again as you're taking casualties and at some point losing dice, right? So this scenario calls for a castle with a moat, which again, not really what you think of right away when you think of a World War II scenario, and again, not something also everyone's going to have ready-made as a terrain piece, right? So that being said, many different ways to improvise, and you could just simply designate a castle area as well, or just use a largish building that you could use as a stand-in, because again, not exactly the most common thing you think of for World War II terrain, right? Having a castle. So, as we say here, any large building, even a hill, something, again, just large and massive here as a terrain piece will do. And then, just you'll have to improvise a little bit with the moat if you don't really have like handy river terrain or something like that. But again, even something like blue strips of paper or blue felt or something cut to shape, you don't always have to go with the super expensive options either. So the castle sits in the middle of a short end of the table. It should be about 30 wide and 6 deep, which tells you again roughly just this is a pretty hefty terrain piece, and a 6-inch moat. The rest of the table needs a good covering of terrain features, so ponds, ditches, trees, anything else that would be a danger to the paratroopers, and then they give you a bit of a guide as to what that should look like here. So that takes care of setup, but again, feel free to play around with this, improvise a little bit. You could move the castle slightly different locations, add that in as a little bit more of a centralized feature. You could go from here, basically move it up a little bit, dominate more of the table. So there's just all kinds of different options. You could play around with the moat a little bit too, make something a little more complicated. So just lots of little variations there. So we'll be right back as we get into the other details of the scenario. All right, guys, so continuing on here, deployment-wise, the Allied forces start the game on the table. No order is required to get them there, but again, you're going to have more units than dice, right? But the precise location of each unit should be randomized with the sticks special rule. Again, reference that, and we'll have separate videos on a lot of the special rules here for Market Garden in a separate video. But the initial German patrols start in any 2 diametrically opposed corners of the board. And then the objective here for the U.S. is basically they have to get off of one short end of the table, decided by a die throw, and the Germans have to prevent as many Americans from doing that as they possibly can. So So whether the Americans flee off towards the castle or the other edge, as we saw from the look at the suggested deployment, it's going to be a little bit random, and it's going to be rough because, again, you have more units than dice, essentially. So the first turn, all the American units start the game on the table, as do the first 2 German patrols. So again, right now at the start, the Americans have an advantage, but as we saw in the scenario description, right, Germans are going to be very rapidly adding forces to the table. Any unit from either side can be given any order, so no restrictions there. And basically the game duration here, the pressure is on the US player to get off the table as quickly as possible because they landed in the wrong spot, and obviously mitigate losses. And then the Germans have to do what they can to basically disrupt, delay, but really the Germans won't match the American numbers on this, even with all the reinforcements. So if at the end of turn 6 the Germans have more units on the table than the Americans, you get one more turn. And victory here. So the onus is on the Allied player to ensure victory by making a successful exit from the table. So extracting 12 or more units is a decisive victory, which is like all but 1. So that seems very high. You might need to play around with that number a little bit. 9, 10, or 11 units is a marginal victory, which again is like, if they're saying you get like 13 units or so to start with, that just again seems very, very high. You really can't afford much in the way of mistakes. And anything else is a triumph for the Germans. So, if the scenario seems kind of one-sided after a playthrough or two, you might play around with those victory conditions just a little bit, okay? And then alternative settings. So it's always, again, nice to play with variations on this, right? So we've often talked about in our other scenario reviews, throwing things in like weather, conditions, nighttime certainly. So there's just lots of fun things that can really make this more intense too. Just be aware of how some of those things may impact forces and things like that. So, if there's already a clear advantage to one side or another, does adding those things in, either hurt or hinder or make it more lopsided. So again, you just got to be careful with balance, but that being said, it's still fun to try other things. So these paratroopers happen to drop at Heeswijk, but any American airborne unit might easily have had a similar experience. As it says here, the entire British Air Armada was heading to 3 adjacent drop zones, landing zones. So although the odd glider landed in the wrong direction, there were major mishaps, whereas the Americans had several drop zones all over like 40 miles here. So basically, if you can pick different parts of the Market Garden Theater, so again, as maybe part of a larger campaign, and just pick multiple different locations. So again, you have a sort of a scenario template here, and you can make your variations there. Players might choose to agree on the nature of the terrain, so something like suitable terrain versus just very unsuitable terrain, tough terrain, swamps, woodlands, like dropping into a town, right? And maybe starting with like casualties or wounded. Maybe not only do you have to get off the table, but you have to also sort of designate a number of injured models, and then try and also carry those off the table. So you can come up with extra little rules and make some fun stuff happen there. So let us know in the comments, guys, what you think of a scenario like this. Have you actually played through this in Market Garden? Would you like to try something like that? And again, as far as the way the scenario is initially outlined here, there's definitely a fair bit required here as far as models. They're saying like a paratrooper company. That's a lot for some people to field. So if you don't quite have that, don't be scared off of the scenario. Basically, you could just cut the forces in half and still get a viable scenario. You might tweak the table size and things like that. But again, you have options, and it seems like a fun one, and again, something a little different than the typical bolt action scenario. So hit us up in the comments, guys. Let us know what you think. Like and subscribe as always for more, and we will see you in the next one. Take care.